The paradox of this war has always been timing. Moscow measures progress in months and seasons. The West measures it in news cycles, and Ukraine, caught between the two, measures it in equipment deliveries that arrive too late and promises that expire before they materialise. In late 2025, this mismatch reached its terminal phase. While Western analysts debated whether the front had stabilised, and NATO officials issued carefully worded statements about continued support, Russia quietly unveiled a new missile system and repositioned forces in a pattern that should alarm anyone paying attention. The road to Odessa is no longer a theoretical concern. It is becoming an operational reality. This is not about a single weapon system. Missiles come and go. What matters is what this unveiling signals about Moscow's timeline, its confidence, and its strategic priorities for 2026. The new system, a hypersonic-capable variant designed for precision strikes against hardened infrastructure, represents not escalation for its own sake, but preparation. Preparation for a phase of the war that most Western capitals still refuse to acknowledge is coming. Today we will examine how the battlefield geometry has shifted irreversibly southward, why Odessa has emerged as the structural objective that defines Russian strategic thinking, and what the unveiling of a new strike capabilities tells us about the timeline Moscow is working toward. We will also address the uncomfortable questions that Western media continues to avoid. What happens when Ukrainian defensive lines collapse not in one dramatic moment but through systematic erosion? And what options remain when the financial architecture sustaining Kyiv begins to crumble in mid-2026? To understand where this war is heading, we must first acknowledge where it has been. 2025 was not a year of dramatic breakthroughs or sudden collapses. It was something more dangerous. The year of cumulative, systemic degradation that Western narratives consistently failed to capture. The pattern repeated across every sector of the front. First, Ukrainian positions would come under sustained pressure. Then, Western analysts would dismiss concerns, pointing to elastic defence and trading space for time. Next, pro-Ukrainian media would produce optimistic assessments about Russian losses and imminent exhaustion. Finally, weeks or months later, the positions would fall and the cycle would begin again at the next defensive line. This happened in Avdiivka. It happened in Chasiv Yar. It happened across the Donbass salient and along the Kharkiv axis. Each time, the explanation shifted. Command failures, ammunition shortages, rotation problems, political interference. What never shifted was the outcome: ground lost, positions abandoned, and the front line creeping westward in increments that individually seemed manageable but cumulatively amounted to strategic disaster. By autumn 2025, the cumulative toll became impossible to ignore. According to data compiled by military analysts tracking geolocated footage, Ukraine lost effective control of approximately 2,300 square kilometers of territory during the year. This figure excludes contested grey zones and counts only areas where Russian forces established verified presence. For context, this represents more territorial change than any year since the initial 2022 invasion, yet it occurred against a supposedly degraded Russian military that Western sources claimed was on the verge of collapse. The human cost proved equally devastating. While precise casualty figures remain classified, intercepted communications and medical evacuation patterns analysed by independent researchers suggest Ukrainian forces suffered between 180,000 and 240,000 total casualties during 2025, including killed, wounded, captured, and missing. Even taking the lower estimate, this represents roughly 15,000 men per month, a rate that exhausts trained reserves faster than mobilization can replace them. Understanding Russian operational method is essential to predicting what comes next. Western commentary consistently misreads Russian intentions because it projects Western military doctrine onto an adversary that operates according to different principles. NATO doctrine emphasizes speed, precision, and decisive engagement. The assumption is that wars should be won quickly through superior technology and overwhelming force applied at critical points. This produces an expectation that Russia should be attacking cities directly, seeking rapid territorial gains, and measuring success in dramatic advances. Russian doctrine, particularly as evolved through the Ukraine campaign, operates differently. The emphasis is on systematic degradation, positional advantage, and forcing the enemy to choose between bad options. Direct assaults on fortified urban centres waste resources and generate casualties. Encirclement achieves the same objective at lower cost by cutting supply lines, isolating garrisons, and creating conditions where defenders must either withdraw, surrender, or die in place. We saw this pattern at Bakhmut, where Russian forces spent months securing the flanks before the city itself became untenable. We saw it at Avdiivka, where the actual urban assault came only after systematic reduction of supporting positions made continued defence impossible. We are seeing it now at Pokrovsk, where Russian advances north and south of the city are creating the geometric conditions for encirclement rather than frontal assault. The same logic applies at operational scale. The Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, often described as the linchpin of Ukrainian defence in Donbass, is not a target for direct assault. It is a target for encirclement. Russian advances toward Pokrovsk from the south and continued pressure from the Lyman direction in the north are creating the conditions where this urban complex of approximately 300,000 pre-war residents becomes an indefensible salient rather than a fortress. Military analysts at the Royal United Services Institute noted in their October 2025 assessment that Russian operational planning appears oriented toward creating multiple dilemmas simultaneously rather than concentrating force for breakthrough operations. This is not a weakness, but a strategy. By threatening multiple axes, Russian forces compel Ukrainian commanders to disperse limited reserves, preventing the concentration necessary for effective counterattacks. For 3 years, Donbass dominated strategic attention. The industrial heartland, the symbolic cities, the fortified lines built since 2014, all focused minds on the Eastern Front. This focus was not wrong, exactly, but it was incomplete. The true centre of gravity was always further south. The shift became apparent in late 2025 when Russian force positioning began changing in ways that frontline observers noted, but strategic analysts underappreciated. Reinforcements that might have been directed toward Pokrovsk or the Kharkiv axis instead flowed towards Zaporizhzhia Oblast. Engineering units appeared in sectors that had been quiet for months. Artillery concentrations increased along the southern line of contact in patterns inconsistent with defensive postures. Why does the south matter more than the east? The answer lies in geography, economics, and strategic logic. Geographically, the Zaporizhzhia axis offers something Donbass cannot: a path to decisive strategic effect. Taking Pokrovsk or even Kramatorsk would be symbolically significant and operationally useful, but it would not fundamentally change the structure of the war. Ukraine would fall back to the next line, Western aid would continue, and the attritional grind would persist. The southern axis is different. Zaporizhzhia city sits at the intersection of critical infrastructure, the Dnipro river crossing, the main north-south rail lines, and the road networks connecting eastern Ukraine to Odessa and the western regions. Controlling Zaporizhzhia does not just capture territory, it severs connections. Economically, southern Ukraine contains the agricultural heartland, the port infrastructure, and the industrial capacity that sustain the Ukrainian war economy. The east is valuable, but already devastated. The south remains functional, and that functionality is what makes it strategically decisive. Russian military planners understand this. Analysis of intercepted communications by Estonian intelligence, reported in November 2025, indicated that southern military district planning documents reference Zaporizhzhia as the gateway, with timeline projections extending into the second half of 2026. These are not aspirational statements, but operational planning parameters. Odessa occupies a unique position in Russian strategic thinking. It is not merely a military objective, but an existential one, for Ukraine, not Russia. Understanding this asymmetry is crucial. For Ukraine, Odessa represents survival. The city handles approximately 60% of Ukrainian grain exports in peacetime, and remains the primary connection to global maritime trade even under wartime restrictions. The port infrastructure, though partially blocked by Russian naval presence, still enables the export corridors that generate hard currency and maintain international engagement. Losing Odessa would transform Ukraine from a wounded but functioning state into an economically unviable, landlocked remnant, dependent entirely on Western charity. The cultural dimension matters equally. Odessa is a Russian-speaking city with deep historical ties to the Russian imperial project. Its incorporation into Ukraine was always contested in Russian nationalist historiography, and its potential liberation carries symbolic weight that purely territorial gains in Donbas cannot match. This is not to justify Russian claims, but to explain Russian motivation. Here is what Western analysis consistently misunderstands. The road to Odessa does not run along the coast. The obvious route, pushing west from Crimea through Mykolaiv, is a trap. The terrain favours defence, the distances are enormous, and Ukrainian forces concentrated precisely against this threat. Any coastal advance would face the same attritional mathematics that have characterised the Donbass fighting, except across even more unfavourable ground. The actual road to Odessa runs inland. It goes through Zaporizhzhia. It crosses the Dnipro at points where Russian forces can establish bridgeheads. It cuts the supply lines that sustain Ukrainian forces in the south before those forces can be engaged directly. Military geography dictates this logic. The Dnipro River is both an obstacle and an opportunity. Ukrainian defensive planning assumes the river as a barrier, concentrating forces and fortifications accordingly. But rivers can be crossed, and once crossed, they become barriers to reinforcement rather than defence. Russian engineering capabilities, demonstrated repeatedly in bridging operations during the war, make river crossing achievable given sufficient preparation and fire superiority. The timeline for this operation is not 2025, it is 2026 or 2027. Russian strategic patience should not be mistaken for inability. What we are witnessing now, the force repositioning, the infrastructure strikes, the systematic degradation of Ukrainian air defence in the south, represents preparation rather than execution. This brings us to the missile unveiling that prompted today's analysis. The new system, designated in Western tracking as a variant of the Iskander-M with enhanced hypersonic characteristics, is not revolutionary in isolation. What matters is its role in a broader campaign. Since autumn 2024, Russian strike patterns have shifted from apparent randomness to systematic targeting. The emphasis is no longer on terror or punishment, but on military effect. Energy infrastructure remains a target, but the focus has narrowed to nodes that directly support military logistics. Transformer stations serving rail lines, power plants supplying defence industrial facilities, and communication hubs coordinating air defence networks. The Ukrainian air defence network, once celebrated as surprisingly effective, has degraded substantially. According to assessments by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies published in September 2025, Ukraine's operational SAM inventory has declined by approximately 40% since peak levels in early 2024. Replacement deliveries have not matched expenditure rates, and the systems provided often lack the integration and training necessary for optimal effectiveness. This degradation is not accidental. Russian strike planning explicitly targets air defence radars, command posts and missile stocks. Each Patriot battery destroyed or damaged represents months of replacement time, given production constraints and competing global demands. The cumulative effect creates expanding windows of vulnerability that Russian planners can exploit. The new missile system fits this pattern. Its characteristics, reportedly including improved accuracy against mobile targets and enhanced penetration capabilities against hardened structures, suggest a weapon optimized for suppression of enemy air defenses. The timing of its unveiling, coinciding with force repositioning in the south, indicates operational rather than political motivation. What this means practically: Russian air superiority over southern Ukraine, already significant, will likely become dominant by mid-2026. This dominance will not manifest as aircraft freely operating over the front. That remains too risky given man-portable systems, but as the ability to strike operational and strategic targets with near impunity. Bridges, supply depots, command posts, reserves moving to reinforce threatened sectors. Air superiority of this type does not win wars by itself, but it creates conditions where ground operations become dramatically more effective and less costly. The attritional mathematics that have characterized this war shift decisively when one side can interdict reinforcement and resupply while the other cannot. The strategic picture cannot be understood without addressing escalation dynamics, particularly the troubling pattern of attacks inside Russia attributed to Ukrainian forces. Western media treats these incidents with characteristic ambiguity. When drones struck near Moscow in summer 2025, Reporting emphasized Ukrainian denials and Russian claims without resolution. When explosions occurred at facilities linked to Russian strategic forces, analysis focused on technical questions rather than strategic implications. This studied neutrality obscures a dangerous reality. Whether Ukraine directly conducted these operations, enabled them through intelligence sharing, or merely provided political cover for Western agencies operating semi-autonomously, the effect remains the same. Escalation pressure on a nuclear-armed adversary increasingly convinced that it faces an existential rather than limited conflict. Russian threat perception matters regardless of Western intentions. If Moscow believes, rightly or wrongly, that NATO is enabling strikes against strategic assets and even leadership targets, Russian response calculus changes accordingly. The new missile systems, the expanded strike authorities evident in recent targeting, and the hardening rhetoric from Russian officials all suggest this perception is becoming operational reality. This is not to defend Russian aggression, or to suggest Ukraine should accept defeat passively. It is to observe that escalation has consequences that extend beyond immediate tactical effects. Each strike inside Russia that demonstrates expanded capability simultaneously demonstrates that negotiated resolution becomes less likely, and that Russian planners must prepare for longer and more intense conflict. The United States occupies a peculiar position in this dynamic. Official policy emphasizes negotiation and eventual settlement. Operational reality suggests continued and perhaps expanded support for operations that make settlement more difficult. This is not contradiction, but rather bureaucratic reality. Intelligence agencies pursuing institutional objectives that may diverge from stated policy, allied services operating with varying degrees of coordination, and political leaders preferring ambiguity to accountability. The result is a dual policy that satisfies no one and resolves nothing. Russia perceives it as confirming maximalist Western objectives. Ukraine perceives it as insufficient commitment. European allies perceive it as unpredictable. And the war continues while all parties wait for clarity that never arrives. This dual policy feeds directly into the failure of every negotiation framework proposed since 2022. The pattern is predictable. Proposals emerge, are debated publicly, and collapse upon contact with reality. Consider the land swap proposals floated in late 2025. The logic seemed elegant on paper. Ukraine cedes de facto Russian-controlled territories in exchange for security guarantees and accelerated Western integration. Think tanks produced maps, diplomats held back-channel discussions, opinion pieces proclaimed the virtues of pragmatism. 3 problems destroyed this framework before it could be seriously tested. First, the battlefield refuses to cooperate with negotiators' timelines. Any freeze-line proposal assumes static positions, but Russian operations continued throughout the diplomatic maneuvering. Territory that might have been conceded in October was no longer available to concede by December because it had already fallen. Negotiating over a moving front line is like drawing property boundaries during an earthquake. Second, Russia has demonstrated no interest in freezing a conflict it believes it is winning. From Moscow's perspective, why accept today what tomorrow's operations might improve? The Kremlin's demands have expanded, not contracted, as military progress continued. Demilitarization, denazification, NATO withdrawal from Eastern Europe. These are not negotiating positions but maximalist objectives that no Ukrainian government could accept and survive. Third, Ukrainian domestic politics make meaningful concessions impossible, regardless of battlefield reality. President Zelensky staked his legitimacy on territorial integrity. The constitutional framework prohibits ceding territory without referendum. The population, having endured 3 years of war, views concessions as betrayal rather than pragmatism. Any leader who signed such a deal would face immediate political destruction and possible prosecution. The result is a negotiation framework that exists only in think tank papers and diplomatic fantasies. Russia will not stop while winning. Ukraine cannot concede while surviving politically. And Western mediators offer proposals from both military and political reality. This is not a problem that more creative diplomacy can solve. It is a structural impasse that only battlefield outcomes can break. Wars ultimately depend on resources, and Ukraine's resource situation is approaching critical thresholds. Western military aid has sustained Ukrainian operations since 2022, but aid is not infinite. The United States provided approximately $75 billion in total assistance through 2025, a figure that represents both genuine commitment and political controversy. European contributions, though substantial in aggregate, have been fragmented across dozens of national programs with varying effectiveness and reliability. The fundamental problem is structural. Ukraine's domestic economy has contracted by approximately 35% since the invasion. Tax revenues cover less than half of government expenditure. The deficit is financed entirely through Western support, primarily IMF facilities and bilateral grants. This arrangement works as long as Western political will persists, but political will is not a stable commodity. American support faces congressional uncertainty with every budget cycle. European support faces both fiscal constraints and rising populist challenges. The rhythm of democratic politics, with its election cycles and shifting priorities, poorly matches the sustained commitment that indefinite warfare requires. Financial analysts tracking Ukrainian fiscal sustainability project exhaustion of current funding arrangements by mid-2026. This does not mean immediate collapse, but rather a crisis point where choices become stark. Either Western donors dramatically expand commitments, accepting the domestic political costs of open-ended warfare support, or Ukraine faces currency collapse, import cessation, and inability to maintain military operations at current intensity. The discussed alternative, seizing Russian sovereign assets frozen in Western jurisdictions, represents less a solution than an admission of desperation. The approximately $300 billion in frozen assets could theoretically finance years of continued fighting, but the legal and precedential implications of such seizure have prevented implementation. Crossing this threshold would represent escalation of a different sort, economic warfare that establishes doctrines applicable far beyond the Russia-Ukraine context. Even if implemented, asset seizure merely delays rather than resolves the underlying arithmetic. Ukraine cannot generate sufficient domestic resources to sustain modern warfare against a larger adversary. Western support must either become permanent and expanding, or the war must end. There is no middle ground that the mathematics permits. European strategic thinkers are beginning to recognize what American political discourse still obscures. The United States may not remain a reliable partner for indefinite conflict on the European periphery. This recognition produces anxiety rather than adaptation. European defence industrial capacity, hollowed out by decades of peace dividend assumptions, cannot replace American production at any relevant timeline. European political systems designed for consensus and deliberation struggle to generate the rapid decisions that military support requires. European publics, facing inflation and energy costs directly traceable to war-related disruptions, show declining enthusiasm for continued sacrifice. The numbers are stark. European defence industrial output, despite emergency expansion programs, remains approximately 30% of what would be required to sustain Ukrainian operations at current intensity without American contribution. Ammunition production has increased but remains insufficient. Advanced systems, particularly air defence, depend on American components and integration that cannot be rapidly indigenized. What happens if Zaporizhzhia falls? What happens if Odessa comes under direct threat? The honest answer is that European capitals have not seriously gamed these scenarios, because doing so would reveal the gap between rhetoric and capability. The likely response would be panic, emergency summits, pledges of support that cannot be immediately implemented, and desperate appeals to Washington for renewed commitment. This is not European weakness per se, but rather the consequence of strategic choices made over decades. The architecture of European security assumed American commitment as a constant rather than a variable. Adjusting that architecture requires time that the current crisis may not permit. The optimistic scenario involves Russian exhaustion arriving before Ukrainian collapse, a race between degrading Russian capability and Ukrainian sustainability. The pessimistic scenario, which current trajectories increasingly suggest, involves Ukrainian defensive failure, while European alternatives remain unready. The catastrophic scenario involves both military collapse and political crisis, a perfect storm where European populations reject continued support just as that support becomes most critical. The convergence of these factors makes 2026 the most dangerous year of the war, not because dramatic events are guaranteed, but because the structural conditions for dramatic events will be in place. Militarily, Russian force generation continues despite attrition. Monthly recruitment, combining contract soldiers and mobilized personnel, has averaged approximately 25,000 to 30,000 men throughout 2025, according to tracking by Conflict Intelligence Team and other open-source analysts. This rate, while not sufficient for major offensive operations across the entire front, is adequate for concentrated pressure on selected axes. The force positioning observed in late 2025 suggests southern Ukraine as the priority axis for 2026 operations. This does not preclude activity elsewhere. Indeed, maintaining pressure across multiple fronts serves Russian operational objectives by preventing Ukrainian redeployment. But the weight of effort, the engineering preparation, and the strike campaign focus all point south. Ukrainian defensive capacity faces simultaneous challenges. Manpower remains the critical constraint. Despite expanded mobilization, authorities passed in spring 2024, actual recruitment has consistently fallen short of targets. The pool of military-age men willing and able to serve is finite, and 3 years of war have substantially depleted it. Training quality has declined as the need for rapid deployment overwhelms institutional capacity for proper preparation. Equipment presents the other constraint. Western deliveries have slowed as production limitations and competing priorities reduce available stocks. The much-discussed F-16 transfers arrived in numbers insufficient to alter air domain dynamics. Armour losses continue to exceed replacement rates, despite European efforts to provide additional tanks and fighting vehicles. Economically, the mid-2026 financial threshold coincides with what may be a period of maximum military pressure. If Russian planners are competent, and evidence suggests they are, they will time major operations to exploit moments of maximum Ukrainian vulnerability. A southern offensive coinciding with fiscal crisis would present Ukrainian leadership with impossible choices: defend the south with depleted forces, or accept territorial losses that may prove irreversible. Politically, 2026 brings both American and European electoral dynamics that complicate sustained support. Congressional uncertainty persists regardless of presidential election outcomes. European governments face domestic pressures that make expanded commitments difficult to sustain. The risk is not that Western support ends abruptly, but that it becomes unreliable at precisely the moment reliability matters most. What makes 2026 uniquely dangerous is not any single factor, but their simultaneous convergence. Consider the scenario that Russian planners may be anticipating. By summer 2026, Ukrainian air defense has degraded to the point where Russian aviation can operate with acceptable risk over southern sectors. Simultaneously, Ukrainian reserves have been depleted by continued Donbass operations through winter and spring. Western ammunition deliveries have slowed due to production bottlenecks and political uncertainty, and Kiev faces a fiscal cliff requiring emergency measures that distract leadership and damage morale. Into this environment, Russian forces launch a concentrated southern operation, not a dramatic blitzkrieg but a methodical advance towards Zaporizhzhia, combining the encirclement tactics refined over 3 years with air superiority that prevents effective Ukrainian response. The city does not fall immediately but comes under siege, supply lines are cut, the civilian population begins evacuating, and suddenly the theoretical becomes actual. European capitals, having avoided serious contingency planning, scramble to respond. Emergency summits produce pledges but not immediate capability. American political attention is consumed by electoral politics, and Ukraine faces the prospect of losing not just territory, but strategic viability. This is not prediction, but scenario. Many factors could alter the trajectory. Russian logistics might fail, Ukrainian adaptation might succeed, Western commitment might solidify. But the structural conditions making this scenario plausible are assembling now, and the window for altering them is narrowing. We return finally to Odessa and what it represents. In Russian strategic thinking, Odessa is not merely a military objective but the culmination of a historical project. The city's founding under Catherine the Great, its role as Russia's window to the Mediterranean, its cultural prominence in Russian literature and memory, all these create symbolic weight that purely military calculations cannot capture. Russian leadership genuinely believes, whether correctly or not, that Odessa's incorporation into Russia represents historical justice rather than conquest. For Ukraine, Odessa represents something different, but equally existential. It is not just a port or a city, but the physical manifestation of Ukraine's connection to the wider world. Landlocked Ukraine is not merely diminished Ukraine, but fundamentally different Ukraine, dependent, isolated, and vulnerable in ways that maritime access prevents. The road to Odessa, as we have discussed, runs through Zaporizhzhia and across the Dnipro. It is not a road that can be travelled quickly or easily, but it is a road that Russian military planning is increasingly oriented toward, and the infrastructure being put in place, the strike campaigns being conducted, the force positioning being observed, all suggest serious intent rather than posturing. Western policy faces a choice it has consistently deferred: either commit the resources necessary to make this road impassable, or accept that it may eventually be travelled. Half measures have produced half results, enough to sustain Ukrainian resistance, but not enough to alter fundamental trajectories. The question is whether full measures are politically possible, and the honest answer is that no one knows. The unveiling of a new missile system is, in isolation, a minor event. Weapons are unveiled regularly, and not all translate into battlefield effect. But this unveiling occurs in a context that gives it significance: a southern axis becoming active, a defensive network being systematically degraded, and a financial clock ticking toward crisis. The combination suggests not imminent collapse but approaching inflection. The war that began in February 2022 has entered a phase where outcomes that seemed impossible become plausible and then perhaps inevitable. Not because Russia is invincible or Ukraine is helpless, neither is true, but because structural factors have aligned in ways that favour the larger, more patient adversary. What 2026 brings depends on choices not yet made. Western commitment could expand, altering the equation. Ukrainian adaptation could succeed, creating defensive conditions that frustrate Russian operational planning. Russian miscalculation could produce setbacks that delay or derail the southern campaign. None of these outcomes is impossible, but none is assured. What can be said with confidence is that the road to Odessa is no longer a theoretical concern discussed by strategists over maps. It is becoming an operational reality being prepared by engineers, targeted by missiles, and oriented toward by forces repositioning for campaigns yet to come. The next year will determine whether that road can be blocked, or whether it will eventually be travelled to a destination that transforms not just the war, but the entire European security order for decades to come. The stakes could not be higher, and the time for comfortable assumptions about inevitable outcomes in either direction has passed.